All right, Cardinal family, we are going back to that draft of instructional beliefs that we're looking at a district level. And what I want to talk about today is being data driven. And I want to talk about it on three different fronts. Number one, what do we mean by being data driven? Number two, what kind of data are we talking about looking at? And then number three, how do we examine that data? What's everybody's role in that? And I also want to talk about an Einstein thing here at the end. So, first of all, what does it mean to be data driven? It means that we look at the numbers, the metrics that tell the story of our students so that we can provide the best service possible. And that is a big scope. Really, at its most fundamental level, my favorite level, it means that we look at data that tells us about our students so that you can make instructional decisions at the individual student level. You know those people in your class at an individual level. So when you are interacting with them, when you are designing something for them, you know what that person in that desk needs based on the numbers that you look at. Now, it's not just that. We also look at really big picture because being data driven so that we make the best possible decision for the service we provide for our students goes all the way up to board policy level. But no matter what, when we're looking at making those decisions, we ought to have the data to back it up. Why is this important? To me, it's a lot like going to the doctor. I really like my doctor. I think he's really good at his job. And he gets some metrics when I show up. I mean, he checks my height, he checks my weight, checks my blood pressure, which can be tricky for me. And whatever else is going on, he observes and writes down those metrics and makes an assessment on what I need based on what those numbers tell him. Now, if Doc did not do that and prescribed a treatment, said, I think you need this shot or this surgery or whatever, and hadn't looked at some measurable things, I wouldn't be buying into that treatment. The same thing goes for our students. If we don't look at the metrics that matter for their performance, for their ability, for their assets, and for their points of growth, we don't know what treatment's best. We don't know what instruction is best. So when I say being data driven, at its core, it means we look at the numbers that matter so that we can make the decisions that provide the best possible instructional service to our students from the individual instructional level all the way up to board policy. Now, what numbers are we talking about? We end up talking about things like ACT scores and MAP scores a lot, and those are really important. And those are important, especially that MAP stuff and hopefully that NSCAS growth stuff as we move forward at making individual instructional decisions. And I know that there's more to it than that, but that's a really fundamental piece of it. And we need to make sure that we look at those. So, but that's not just it. And I'm going to kind of blend this into my third point as well, which is talking about what is our role in looking at that. And I know that if you're one of those core content area teachers, it's a lot easier to look at things like MAP and see how that shakes things up for you, see how that impacts your instruction. And sometimes when we're looking at district-wide data, some of that gets a little bit lost on some of us that provide a service outside that core instruction area. Here's what I want you to do. And this is the mindset that I want you to have when you look at data, regardless of your position here in Crete Public Schools. There will be times that you are being shown data that has to do with our reading scores, and you might think, I don't teach reading, and this doesn't have anything to do at a fundamental level with my actual instruction. And there's people in my position who will try to spin this as, everybody teaches reading in some capacity. And I get that, but that's not the spin I want to put on this. If you are looking at data that you don't see how it is fundamentally linked to your content area or your specialty, I need you to look at it beyond the scope of being a teacher. I need you to look at that data as a consumer, as somebody who, like many of you, has students that go to the school that are your own children, and think, if I was looking at this data and this was about a child that was my child that was in that class, is that data meaningful to me? What does this data tell me? Or if I were a community member, hadn't had kids in the system for a long time, but somebody is sharing this data about mathematics achievement in Crete Public Schools, what does that data say to me? What feedback or input do you have on that data, not just from a teacher's perspective, but from a community consumer perspective? I think it's really easy for us sometimes to just box ourselves into our specialization and just look at the data through that scope. Don't just look at it through that scope. Look at it through the scope of a parent. Look at it through the scope of somebody that is a contributor to Crete Public Schools. Look at it somebody that is a contributor to the Crete economy. All of those different things. To that end, I know that sometimes we're looking at other classes and we're going, gosh, that map data isn't the data that I share. What I want you guys to be doing is thinking about what data do I have that is going to be valuable to parents? What data do I have that's going to be valuable to my fellow teachers? And it might not be a linear, direct connection that, oh, this is what's happening in PE class, and here's the data I can share, and this is how it impacts social studies class. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about being able to know our students a little bit better, and somebody that is a history teacher can look at that phys ed data and go, all right, doesn't directly impact what I'm doing in history class, but here's what I notice about it as a consumer of this data. Here's what I notice about it as somebody who cares about our kids in general and all the classes that they take. So don't just think about our data from the perspective of being a teacher, though it is most important that we look at the data so that we can make really good individual instructional decisions. Also look at it and say, how do I see this beyond my scope as just a teacher? Last thing, and man, I've been in this camp before too. My friend David, he's a fellow superintendent, and on his email signature, he has an Einstein quote, and goes something to the effect of, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. And I totally believe in that we do so many things that are just so hard to quantify, yet essential. And sometimes when we really start to dig into data, we're worried about those other things losing their way. Those things are important, but here's what I want you to remember. Even though I wholeheartedly believe that not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted, there's a whole lot of stuff that can be counted and counts. When we are looking at the data that impacts our instructional decisions at the individual level, we are looking at the things we can count that do count. When we are looking at making policy decisions, we are looking at counting the things that do matter. So this isn't one of those times where it's like, hey, if we can't measure it, it doesn't matter. No, there's a lot of things we can't measure that really matter. At the same time, there's a lot of things that really do matter that we can measure and that we need to make good decisions based on what we have measured. So that's my soapbox on what it means to be data-driven. Hey, it's going to be Christmas break before we know it. Gosh, this year's going fast. So hang in there, Cardinals. I'll be back maybe even later this week with our next component when it comes to talking about the draft of instructional beliefs at Crete Public Schools. Gosh, glad we're doing this. Catch you later.